Good evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the president of the Army Heritage Center Foundation, and I'd like to invite you. I'm glad you're joining us tonight for tonight's program. Tonight, we feature James Kitfield, who is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and is a contributing editor to Atlantic Media, published for the Atlantic and National Journal. He was a former senior national security correspondent for National Journal and has written on defense, national security, and foreign policy issues from Washington, D.C. for over 2 decades, publishing hundreds of magazine features, web stories, and reporting from dozens of countries in Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. His reporting from conflict zones such as the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan has won him numerous awards. Mr. Kitfield is an author of 4 books on national security themes. They include Twilight Warriors, The Soldiers, Spies, and Special Agents Who Are Revolutionizing the American Way of War in 2016, War and Destiny, How the Bush Revolution in Foreign and Military Affairs Redefined American Power in 2005, and Prodigal Soldiers, How the Generation of Officers Born of Vietnam Revolutionized the American Style of War, published in 1995. Tonight, he takes us to Afghanistan and Iraq with his latest work, In the Company of Heroes, the inspiring stories of Medal of Honor recipients from America's longest wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey, commented, "If you ever wanted to truly understand bravery, explore the real meaning of sacrifice, or deeply appreciate the cost of our freedom, then you must read this book." Mr. Kitfield is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and a magna cum laude graduate of the University of Georgia, Henry Grady School of Journalism. The floor is now yours, Jim.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you doing this and being here to talk about the book. I noticed that the Army had a birthday recently, so happy birthday to all the Army folks out there.
Yeah, we did 247 years this year.
That's pretty good.
We're already planning for the 250th.
You're showing some good staying power there.
Yes.
So in the Company of Heroes, I got the idea to write this book when the Department of Navy reached out to me and they said they were going to have one of their Navy SEAL team leaders soon to receive the Medal of Honor. And that was Navy SEAL team leader Britt Slavinsky. And did I want to do an interview with him, an exclusive interview for an article? And I said, sure, that sounds interesting. And when I did that interview and heard the story of Britt Slavinsky and Air Force Technical Sergeant John Chapman, who also received the Medal of Honor for the same battle, which is a fairly rare thing, I was just in awe of the story that Slavinsky had to tell me. Tragically, Chapman lost his life in the battle, and it was just almost Homeric in its dimensions. It had decisions on which lives hung. It had the kind of bravery it takes to go back up in a mountain to try to retrieve a fallen comrade, knowing that it's almost certainly a suicide mission. And it had really heart-rending tragedy involved, not only John Chapman, but a number of people from a quick reaction force that tried to rescue them on top of a mountainside. So I was just struck by just how dramatic that story was. And as a correspondent for National Journal, I had spent 20 years covering these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but basically from the strategic level, talking to the generals and the senior officials who made the decisions that impacted these soldiers so dramatically. And I had always wanted to have an excuse to write about the young troops I met on all my embeds and all my trips to Iraq and Afghanistan, who were at the tip of the spear and frequently had my back while I was trying to do my work and tell their story, tell the stories of how the wars were going. So I thought that this would be an interesting way to tell the stories of these troops on the front lines and at the very tip of the spear, to get at what these wars look like to them. And I was kind of gratified when a general who I know reached out and said, I was in charge of this battle space, but I had no idea that this is what it looked like to my troops out there in the front lines. So that was kind of got to why I wrote the book. think you might be muted. Mike.
Okay. Ultimately, you identified 25 soldiers, Marines, and airmen to write about. Was the number specific, or is it just what you felt made a good presentation of what these soldiers, airmen, and Marines did?
No, at the time I wrote the book, the number of troops who had received the Medal of Honor for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were 25. I included them all. Now, I think there's been a couple since then who have received the Medal of Honor that I didn't have time. The book was published last fall. So, you know, I put it to bed probably last summer. So anything after that was, you know, I wasn't able to include, but I wanted to include all the stories because they're all equally representative of a kind of heroism that you just don't you're not exposed to very often, and it's and they each deserve to have their own stories told.
I'm going to take you off what we talked about before. You mentioned the kids who had your back. What did they think of you when you first showed up?
That's an interesting question. I think they were very suspect. In fact, I know that you know, when I first embedded for the invasion of Iraq, I was with the 5th Corps forward headquarters. I was actually with 5th Corps, and you know, covering General Wallace, who was the 3-star Corps commander who was in charge of the invasion. And I told them they were going to let me, you know, cover it from basically Kuwait while they went in, and I would follow on. And I basically said, no, I can't tell this story of this operation, you know, from the rear. And so they put me with a small unit, which was the Forward Tactical Operations Center for 5th Corps, led by a lieutenant colonel. And you know, you'd have thought that he had gotten dropped off a skunk when he first met me. You know, you're going to do what? You're going to embed this journalist with us? So there was a lot of anxiety about having, you know, this whole embed idea. It was the first time it had been used. You know, Secretary Rumsfeld thought that Saddam had been so good at the narrative that, you know, they were the victim, and that it would be good to have journalists, you know, really get a front row seat in the front lines, which is what he did with the embed program. So it started out kind of arm's length. I think there was a lot of, like I said, anxiety in the military's point of view, and I think that's kind of a Vietnam hangover thing, where the military came to blame the media for helping to lose that war. Not altogether the case in my view, but the interesting thing was that once after about a week, when they realized that I was willing to share the hardships with them side by side with what they were going through, and they saw some of my stories, because I'd make a point of making sure my stories got out to everyone I wrote about. It changed very much. They became, you know, it became a pretty close bond between me and the unit I was covering, and you know, like I said, it was the tactical headquarters for the commander of the whole operation. So by the end of it, I think I'd made a lot of friends, and I'd started a sort of relationship with the military that I thought only got better over the years, as you know, the public interest in these conflicts started to wane, and it was up to us journalists to still let the public know that there's a war going on out there, even though you may have turned your attention elsewhere. And I think the soldiers and airmen and Marines all appreciated that.
Okay. As you looked at these individuals who ultimately were recipients of medals of honor, is there a common theme that you discovered?
Yeah, the common theme, Mike, is that they're all volunteers, and so that has its own sort of cultural milieu, if you will. This is the first time the all-volunteer force was, you know, deployed to extended combat since it was established in 1973. And in my first book, Prodigal Soldiers, I had written extensively about the formation of the all-volunteer force, and you know, how the military hated the idea initially, and I had researched it in great depth for that book, and I can tell you without fear of contradiction that the architects of the all-volunteer force could never have imagined the country would send it off to fight two, not one, but two decades-long wars without sort of reinforcing it with the draft and bringing the country behind the war efforts. That just never occurred to them that that could possibly happen. It's why we still have a draft. It's why the military, the all-volunteer force is still relatively small. And of course, over that time frame, the military leadership became enamored with how effective a professional force was. So they never wanted to go back. But what having a relatively small all-volunteer force fight these long wars meant was that they had to keep going back and back and back to fight in these successive combat deployments. And as I've written about, and everyone at this point hopefully knows, and I'm sure your audience knows, a lot of the bad things that happen, especially in terms of PTSD, every time you go back to a combat zone, the degree to which you will likely to have PTSD and the severity of it increases. And it was just brutal on families and children. It was brutal on the soldiers and the airmen and Marines who missed, Christmases and birthdays and anniversaries. And I wanted to tell that story too, because a lot of these people in the book who I profile, they joined after 9/11, so they knew they were going into combat and going to war. And they volunteered anyway because they're patriotic. And I wanted to talk about what it meant to be a volunteer willing to go to war for your country when you're only 1% of the population of that country. And I think that's why, as General Petraeus says in reviewing the book, he and many of others who are privileged to lead the all-volunteer force consider them the new greatest generation.
You talk about them, being volunteers. What did they think of the rest of the population that was home at times?
I've written a fair amount about that. I think it kind of changed over time because there was clearly we didn't make the mistake that the country made during and after Vietnam, where we somehow blamed the troops we sent to fight an unpopular war for that war, and that was very traumatic for the Vietnam generation of soldiers who returned, who some of them were spit on, their uniforms were afraid to wear their uniforms off base because they would be harassed or called baby killers. That didn't happen, I think, and I think that's a good thing. I think the country learned its mistake, and there was obviously a great respect for the troops who we sent off to fight those wars in return, and it's there in that comment. We appreciate your service, or we respect your service. But after a while, I also think that the message a lot of returning vets and troops heard was, we appreciate you going so we don't have to go. And I think that was alienating. I mean, I know for a fact, as I've interviewed a lot of soldiers on this, is that it was very alienating to go to the horrors of war and to return very quickly. It wasn't like you're returning on a troop ship, over a matter of weeks or months after World War II. I mean, you're whisked out of these war zones and you're back in a flash. And to find a country that wasn't at war, it was going to the mall. It was just, it was just normal sort of activity. And I know a lot of them found that very alienating. I think that probably contributed to a lot of the problems that there have been with PTSD and suicides. It's, I heard the comment many times. A lot of them, raise their hand to redeploy because it just seems so bizarre to them that to think about their fellow troops out there fighting these desperate battles while they're back at home in a country that doesn't think it's at war.
You mentioned this was our longest war. Did you cover Desert Shield, Desert Storm?
I did cover that, yeah. And also my first book was really a profile of all the commanders in Desert Shield and Desert Storm.
When you talk about the soldier experience, how did you see it different?
Well, Desert Storm was very quick. It was an overwhelmingly successful operation, but it was very quick, and it was against a very overmatched foe. I mean, if you wanted to compare that any part of these wars to Desert Storm, it would be the first 3 weeks in Iraq, 3.5 weeks, where we, the U.S. military went from Kuwait and toppled the Saddam regime in 3.5 weeks. That was remarkably successful. And you remember the banners of mission accomplished, et cetera. I mean, it was really kind of like that. And the hope then was that there would be a similar success. But as General Powell once said, you break it, you own it. And we broke Iraq, and so we owned it. And his one general said to me, it's a heck of a lot easier to invade a country and topple a regime than it is to occupy a country. And that's what we ended up doing for over a decade. And that is tough duty, because the enemy goes to school on you. They're not in any uniform, so they're hiding in plain sight. They're insurgents. It's a much tougher, dirtier, nastier fight. We do high intensity regime change type operations, airland battle, however you want to refer to them, very, very well, better than probably not only anyone else, but probably better than we have in any other period in our country history. But it's a different situation to topple a regime. We learned that in Afghanistan too. We toppled the Taliban with a relative handful of special forces and U.S. air power married to the Northern Alliance in a matter of weeks. So that was pretty easy. Sticking around for 20 years and trying to, establish some stability, very, very hard against a determined.
One of the large murals that we have here, we have an exhibit on Iraq and Afghanistan to let the public get a sense. And they have a basically wall-sized mural backlit of Mosul in 2010 with a infantry squad moving through. And there's not a smiling face to be seen anywhere in that crowd. So
no.
You talk about the challenge of a long-term occupation, you can see that.
Yep.
As you went through these different narratives, looking at each of these 25 individuals, what surprised you that you found? One of the surprises to me was I fully expected to be a lot of dramatic action, descriptions of battles and horrific, but also very dramatic. But the courage that is in these pages is frequently far away from any battlefield. And when I say that, I'm talking about people who are grievously injured, maybe in some cases jumped on a grenade and were, it was a miracle they survived. And so the rest of their immediate life is spent under the surgeon's scalpel. Just excruciating scenes of recovery, traumatic brain injury. There's also the courage of Gold Star families, because some of the people I profile in this book are, received the Medal of Honor posthumously. So I would talk to their families, and the courage the families would show in being willing to recall the heartrending grief they felt, but they wanted to do it so their sons' lives could be told and their stories could be told. I mean, there was courage in that as well. So I was kind of struck by sort of the repercussions of these stories and how they affect people's lives and families going forward. That was one surprise. Another surprise was again, I expected to be telling stories of bravery and heroism, but there's a lot of stories of love and tenderness in these stories. And it could be the love of someone who's willing to jump on a grenade or a suicide vest and make the ultimate sacrifice for his fellow soldiers or Marines. It could be the love of someone who gets during an ambush at night, young Green Beret who when his unit is ambushed in the snowy mountains at night, he is told to retreat after his captain is seriously wounded, and while the rest of the unit retreats, he plows forward into the teeth of the ambush to give them time to retreat. And there's the love of people Navy SEALs who go behind a door at night to rescue an American hostage, even after the first person through that door is cut down by gunfire. They still pile through that door. So there's all kinds of stories of love and
that I found extremely moving in writing the book and researching it.
You talk about the individuals, really the ones that survived that you got an opportunity to talk to. Did they sometimes say that they were disassociated with what they were doing? It's almost like they weren't thinking about what their actions were until they just reacted.
Yes, yes. In fact, one of the recipients who I interviewed was Flo Groberg, who really a fascinating, great guy. But he had actually written, and many of these guys have written their own full-length books about their experiences. He wrote a book, 8 Seconds of Heroism. So his comment was, and his theme is, you know, it was 8 seconds where I was just reacting. I was doing my job and I was just reacting and didn't stop to think, is this heroic? Is this stupid? Is this brave? Is this suicidal? Just reacted. And there is some of that in these stories as well. But there's also some very drawn out battles where, I mean, like I said, Britt Slavinsky and John Chapman, I mean, their story was in Battle of Anaconda and in Afghanistan, being inserted at the top of a mountain at night to provide overwatch for this big operation in the valley below. They arrive a little late. There's an Al-Qaeda heavy unit embedded at the top of the mountain for the same reason as overwatch for Al-Qaeda. They get their helicopter gets ambushed, and retreating from that kill zone, one of the SEALs falls out, Neil Roberts, and then the helicopter crash lands. They get taken back to base eventually, and they've got to make a decision. There's an indication from a drone that Roberts might still be alive, but he was surrounded by Al-Qaeda, dug in Al-Qaeda positions. And do we go back and try to get him? It was almost certainly a suicide mission. And they had to make that decision. And Slavinsky, you know, harkened back to his days as a Eagle Scout. And he said, you know, I wasn't an Eagle Scout, so I can't recite exactly what the mantra was, but it's to the effect of, I swear to do my duty, to do my best to do my duty. And he figured he hadn't done his best to do his duty. So, you know, they go back up and they're to really tragic effects. John Chapman is lost in the fight. They get separated. They retreat down the hillside. Chapman is unconscious in a fighting position that he's cleared of Taliban, and he fights on heroically. This is all captured by a Predator drone that's videoing at night. So, yeah, it's just stories like that where it's, you know, thinking about those guys sitting around and when he told them, his team's 5-man team, you know, of his decision to go back up and try to find Roberts and bring him home, not one of them, you know, said squad. They all said, okay, that's what we'll do. We'll go get them, knowing that, I mean, it's almost certainly that they would not be returning. So it's amazing stuff.
Almost like Randy Shugart at Mogadishu, that they knew that they were going on a mission they might not come back with. How many of these, I don't want to get into that type of detail, were soldiers trying to save other soldiers, not to leave that comrade behind? Can you, half of them, some of them?
Almost all of them. Almost all of them. I mean, the Medal of Honor, it's almost, if there's a thing that runs through them, it's not someone saving themselves or doing something. It's troops who put their lives on the line and frequently, unfortunately, tragically forfeit their lives to save their brothers in arms. And that runs through all of these, quite honestly. If it's not their brothers in arms, they're trying to save an American hostage in one case, or trying to save 100+ hostages that were being held by ISIS in one example, where an Army Ranger goes 3 times into a burning building to try to, you know, cut the bolt on a prison cell so he could save these hostages. There's not a lot of ego in these stories. It's typically soldiers and troops who, trying to save others, put their lives at forfeit, and that's a common thread.
Have you followed up with any of them since you wrote the book?
Have I? I'm sorry.
Followed up with any of them since you wrote the book?
I have not. I've heard. I have just have had a couple of discussions with some of them and profiled in the book, including Flo Groberg, who we were both on another program together that was hosted by the society, the Medal of Honor Society. And I've heard from some of the families I talked to, but no, that I haven't really followed up. I did my best, and I've heard some good comments from the community, but I don't know. There's some. I don't want to bother them. I mean, recalling these stories, something I learned along the way, is difficult for many of them. It's very difficult for most of them because it reminds them of the worst day of their lives, and it can be a painful experience rehashing that with someone and having someone remind you of that. It's difficult for them. So I totally respect that, and I did my bit trying to tell their stories, but I left it at that.
When you say it's the most difficult day for many of them, we take them up, we put them on the stage, we put the Carmelites there. President of the United States comes out and puts a medal around their neck. Have you ever talked to them about how they feel about that particular moment?
Yeah. And I was at a couple of those ceremonies. I think one of the recipients told me, Salvador Gunta, said to the effect that my name in lights doesn't feel very good to me. I don't want my name in lights. I don't think I did anything particularly heroic. I did my job. Believe me, it was very heroic. But if I can get my fellow brothers in arms names up in light with me, then that's worth it. That I can get behind. And in those ceremonies, almost always the unit they were with gets to come to the White House, go to the receptions, meet the person. They often haven't seen them in years, see their families. And I think they love that. That part of it is very heartwarming, and I know they love that. But standing up and being singled out is not something that sits very well with all of them, because they know that the fundamental truth is there's a lot of heroism in these stories, and a lot of troops could have just as well gotten the medal themselves. I mean, I've heard that constantly. I did nothing that my fellow soldiers wouldn't have done in exactly that moment at that time if they were in exactly my shoes. So yeah, it's kind of a balance. They don't like being singled out, but they like sort of bringing honor onto their brothers in arms.
Okay. There was a psychologist back in the 1950s. He had worked as an intel officer during World War II. Always went up to the front lines and said, there's something different about these people. He then graduates from Columbia with a degree, a PhD, and it bothers him. So he eventually writes a book called Men in Battle, and he describes close combat as a transformational experience. They're no longer Homo sapiens, they're Homo facientes, or fighting man. Is that what you sort of experienced with all of these soldiers that you ran into?
I think
on the front line?
I think so. And I think that I don't think anyone can, and hopefully my stories can help you try to understand it. And it certainly helped me understand it. But I don't think anyone fully understands the bonds that these people have together, because they've had to band together to survive, the most horrific thing you can possibly survive, which is close combat. And almost to a person have lost friends in that effort. And their bonds are, they're sort of wondrous to behold, because they have each other's back for life. I mean, they are a band of brothers. So yeah, I think that's right. I think that they're not like any other group. I think Sebastian Junger has written pretty good about this for this generation in Afghanistan, because he spent time with them in the Korengal.
Right.
And he's done a good job of writing about that. They are part of a very unique tribe, and people from outside that tribe cannot easily understand them. Someone
said once that there are a few people that you don't need to think about who they are in the dark: your spouse and those that you served in combat with. because you just know what they look like, even if it's just a shadow moving.
Yeah,
Sort of a.
it's a great way to put it.
Yeah. You did mention briefly that sometimes the generals didn't understand what it was exactly like on the front line. Is that a generational issue? Because a lot of our senior leaders grew up in the 80s and 90s, and their opportunity to experience that level of close combat as a young lieutenant or captain was lacking?
I don't think that's it. I think it's because, and I spent a lot of time with the generals in combat, and they've got a million things going on, and they understand them. They go to, when there's casualties or a battle that has casualties, that they will fly in there and talk to the people. And so, I mean, they get it kind of intellectually, but their day is filled with a million decisions that affects much bigger group of troops. And so I don't think they have time to sit and contemplate it until maybe when they come home and read a book like mine, hopefully, or told stories from, or visit troops in, Walter Reed or Navy Medical Center and hear it. But I just think it's, your understanding of something depends a lot on where you sit and your distance from what's going on. And I just think that by necessity, they don't, they can't spend all day thinking about, particular battles and what some handful of troops went through.
You observed operations during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, in the Balkans, and then in Iraq, Afghanistan. How did the nature of the fight or the enemy change, and how did that affect our soldiers, especially these soldiers that received the Medal of Honor?
Well, so Desert Storm was, conventional force-on-force battle, something we're very good at, something that, and we were fighting against a pretty overmatched foe. So, not that there wasn't a huge amount of bravery and heroism in that battle as well, but it's, and in the Balkans, it was primarily peacekeeping. It was, having reported from there, there was a lot of horrors there that you kind of witnessed, like digging up, grave sites full of bodies that had been executed by the Serbs. But it wasn't the close combat that you saw. It's at least, yeah, no, it really wasn't the close combat you saw. So, in the first days of both Iraq and Afghanistan were, like I said, Afghanistan, a relative handful of armed special forces and, Northern Alliance allies on the ground, but very quickly successful in toppling the Taliban. And same thing in Iraq in 2003, 3.5, 4 weeks, and we had toppled Saddam. The kind of fighting that we got in after that, the sort of counterinsurgency fighting, is dirty fighting. It's eyeball to eyeball. You don't know where the enemy is coming from. You're constantly worried about IEDs. It's designed to counteract America's advantage in long range fires. So it's a knife fight, and it's ugly and extremely intense, and it's soldier against soldier. A lot of times it's eyeball to eyeball. Sometimes, like in David Balabia's case, it's actually hand-to-hand combat with knives. So it's counterinsurgency is ugly kind of warfare, and they tend to drag on a long time.
Are there any particular stories you'd like to highlight to the group?
I'm asked that question, and they all mean kind of a lot to me, because I think they're all just looking through the chapters. And I mentioned the House of Broken Mirrors, the David Belavia. That was a case in fighting in Fallujah, which was, is really tough fighting against dug-in insurgents who'd had months to plan on that. And they had gone, and they were clearing houses at night, and went into one of these houses, and there was a machine gun, a Taliban, Al-Qaeda machine gun fortified position inside that house. So they get ambushed. They're pinned down. They can't get out. And as I said in the book, in those situations, either someone, the combination of adrenaline and cordite kicks in for someone, or they all could have died. And it kicked in for Belavia, or Bellavia. I think I might be mispronouncing his name. And if I am, sorry, David. But he grabbed his gun was shot out of his hand. He grabs a machine gun and basically pours so much fire into the ambush position that his fellow troops can get out of the house. He retreats out. He takes cover behind a wall and decides that he's pissed off that they didn't clear that house. So he goes back in practically alone. He has one guy pretty far back just to watch his back. And he goes back in that house and hunts down these insurgents. And it's at night, and and the place has been shot up by a Bradley. So it's there's mirrors broken and on the wall, and you can see the faces of the enemy appear in a broken mirror. And he turns around and shoots it, and the guy falls, and then he turns back around and shoots at someone else, and then the guy who falls gone. And so it's just the most harrowing story. And he ends up clearing 2 insurgents, shooting them, goes into a third room, is about to get out of it. Guy's coming down a staircase, he engages him, and then behind him, out of a wardrobe, another insurgent pops out, shoots off a couple of rounds, and then runs up the stairs. He goes up, he follows the guy up the stairs. They get in hand-to-hand combat. He kills the guy in hand-to-hand combat. And finally, sitting down to take a smoke and try to take it all in, what had just happened to him. And another insurgent drops off a terrace above into the room he's in, and he gets in a fight with him and almost gets killed, and finally gets to his gun before the other guy can get to his gun and shoots him. And it was just like, what encouraged you? And his own troops said the same thing. What encouraged you to sort of go back in there practically alone to clear this house? And he couldn't really explain it. It's just that he thought that they were still a threat, and it pissed him off that they had to run out of that house in that first ambush. So with stories like that I just, but there are plenty like that. There are so many stories in this book of just a lot of, I think, sort of people like me and a lot of normal people would say, I just can't imagine making that decision to do that. But yet these really extraordinary individuals make those kinds of decisions, and all these stories where it comes down to, they'll forfeit their life to finish the mission or to save a buddy. And it's pretty wondrous to behold.
I don't want to quiz you. Are you aware of the Medal of Honor value system? The Medal of Honor Society value system?
Value system?
Yeah, they have a set of values that the Medal of Honor recipients are supposed to, loyalty, honesty. I don't have them off the top of my head.
Yeah, I've read it. I can't recite it off the top of my head, but it's.
And when you've talked to some of them at the award ceremony, do they feel they have a lifelong obligation to uphold what the medal means for both themselves and for the soldiers that they say that it really represents?
Yes, absolutely. They all say that. The comment I heard most often was, this is a great honor, but it's really a weighty burden, because not only do I have to relive the worst day of my life when I tell these stories, but I also I have to stand in for the best of the martial martial arts, if you will. And they feel that responsibility very heavily. And I think, and it can weigh on them too. I mean, I like I said, they aren't kidding when they say it's a weighty burden as well as a great honor. And living up to it sometimes, I think, is hard. A lot of them, in fact, I would say probably most of the ones who survived have admitted that they have PTSD, because they want to make the point that even people who are singled out as the bravest of the brave, are still susceptible to, they're human beings, they're still susceptible to the same feelings that everyone else has, and they struggle. And I think that's part of the courage I talked about that comes out away from a battlefield, is even though they struggle with PTSD, they are very public about it, because they want others who might be going through the same thing to reach out and get the help they need.
Okay. You want to take any questions from the audience if I get some?
Sure, happy to.
Folks in the audience, if you wish to submit a question, please use the question and answer icon up on your screen. we talked common background of these stories. You mentioned that. You talked about some of the surprises. Did you see a continuity between those that received awards early in the war and those who were much later? Was there similar?
Well, it's interesting, and I was aware of this just from my own reporting before I wrote the book, was that the kinds of stories, I mean, the narratives in this book trace the entire arc of our experiences in both Afghanistan and Iraq. So you start from the early days of pretty quick successes in both Afghanistan and Iraq, mission accomplished, to a time where the insurgents come roaring back, and we were barely hanging on in Iraq in 2006 and Afghanistan in 2008-9. And then there is stories from the surge both in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we surged troops and we basically changed the momentum and kind of succeeded in fighting to kind of a gray zone where it's not between outright victory, but it certainly wasn't defeat either. And you can see that arc through these stories. And I think the kinds of fighting they went through is also, you can see early on, the fighting was, certainly in Iraq, was, armored warfare type fighting. Paul Smith was, died received the Medal of Honor, died in the battle for the Saddam airport, manning a 50 caliber machine gun and an armored personnel carrier, holding off the whole Republican Guard unit so he wouldn't collapse the flank of the American forces. As you went on, especially in Iraq, the wounds and a lot of the stories were about IEDs and grenades and suicide vests. And in Afghanistan, after about 2007 and 8, became really much an infantryman's war. And you really started to see horrific wounds from people who were hit either by an IED or handheld weapons while on patrol. And that was pretty typical, or their patrol was ambushed.
Yeah, that one Marine, young Marine that we have a photo of that was really sort of significantly damaged up in the facial areas.
Kyle White, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's an amazing person. He turned his terrible wounds into he became kind of a warrior philosopher, if you will. And
Kyle or White, which one? I got.
I'm sorry, Kyle Carpenter.
Yeah.
And he's just an amazing guy. He's really, I mean, a lot of people would have succumbed to their wounds. And he talks about the horrific nightmares he had while he was drugged up and in the hospital, where he's seeing his own funeral from afar. And none of his buddies from his unit would come to his funeral because they were pissed off at him for leaving them in Afghanistan. And just these really, really tough experiences in recuperation, but turns it into a positive in his life, becomes a motivational speaker, just an incredible kid. Got so much respect for him.
Okay. We don't have any questions. How would you like to wrap this up?
Well, I go out and buy my book. No, I will just say that, going back to what David Petraeus said in reviewing the book, was that it reminds us of these, really, in many ways, these volunteers who volunteered for combat, knowing they'd be going into the most horrific thing you can go into, but did it because after 9/11 they felt that's what the country needed, was soldiers and Marines and airmen and naval personnel who would go fight these terrible fights. And they really are, they certainly are to me, the new greatest generation. And I think if you read these stories, you'll understand why a lot of their commanders think the same thing.
Okay. Well, you talk now about how great our volunteers were during the 9/11. Now the Army's having challenges bringing enough new soldiers into the ranks. And I know some in the leadership are getting nervous about would we have to resort back to some type of national service.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a lot about that. I actually feel very uncomfortable with how the all volunteer force has evolved, in the sense that it shouldn't be that easy to send it off to fight for 20 years without asking for any sacrifice from the American people, whether it's even a war tax or anything. But we didn't do any of that. And there is some, I'm not sure that's really healthy for society to have just 1% of it to go off and fight your wars, and while the rest of us, as they say, didn't go to war, went to the mall. Then maybe we have to pay them more. Maybe we have to make life better for them to entice more people into it. I've seen those stories about recruitment struggles, and I think it's probably because we're at full employment as a country right now, and that's always a very challenging time for the military when there's, you know, basically you're at full employment. There's a lot of, you know, it's a lot easier to do most jobs than it is to be a service member. So you know, in times like that, you may have to make it more attractive. You may have to.
Well, we also, you look at some of the advances, societal advances in the 50s and 60s, especially on integration of the Black community much more into the country and some of the social networks. I wonder how much of a result was that of a larger army where everybody was forced together, regardless. And now, yes, it seems that soldiers beget soldiers. If you look at the number of young recruits that have parents who had served, so it's almost like we're becoming a janissary class. Not that we want to become janissaries, but it is as you see, that we had an enlistment ceremony here yesterday, and in the audience was at least 2 or 3 former soldiers and their kids. We had 7 young recruits enter yesterday, and I think 3 or 4 of them had their parents that had also served. So it's
it's a family business in a lot of instances. But you know, I'd also say that, you know, maybe we ought to think about a national service. I mean, that's not a bad idea. I think some people would object to if everyone had to go into the military, but have a Peace Corps like alternative, or have an AmeriCorps alternative, but have everyone serve a year after either high school or college, having to be next to other types of Americans who come from different backgrounds. I think that would be a healthy thing. I think it's one of the things that service members come out of the military feeling like, you know, we're so polarized as a country. You know, if you're red state or blue state, or, you know, it depends on what tribe you're in. And they've been into a tribe that's much more egalitarian and much less concerned about politics, and basically everyone putting their shoulder behind the same wheel and pushing in the same direction. I think that's a really valuable lesson that maybe we could use a lot more of in this country.
Yeah, they normally don't like a person only when that person does not push as hard as everybody else is pushing. That's sort of the criteria.
Yeah, and the military is very good at making sure everyone pushes in the same direction. I mean, they are great indoctrinators of their values, and their values are teamwork. And all the services are very good at that. Army's especially good, but so is the Marine Corps and the Air Force and the Navy. So that kind of indoctrination is into teamwork. And, you know, no matter what you look like, what color your skin is, what your sexual orientation is, whether you're male or female, everyone pushing together. That's when you see it up close, it's a pretty valuable thing. I'd love for more Americans to need to see that.
Take me back. You had, I don't want to say normal unit soldiers. Then you had some Rangers. You had some SEALs. Did you see a difference in the individuals that ultimately received the Medal of Honor based upon their background and the type of unit they were in?
No, because I mean the heroism in all these stories is of a type, and doesn't exist in one service or one specialty. I will say the types of missions they go on are somewhat different. For instance, hostage rescue is a sort of special forces type mission. Snatch and grab missions, where you go into enemy territory and snatch and grab a target. That's a special forces mission. Overwatch behind enemy lines is kind of a special forces mission. But there are plenty of conventional force missions like I said, David Bellavia was not in a special forces unit. He was in a
I think it was 5th Infantry Division.
yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So not in the quality of the soldiers or the type of the heroism that was kind of common throughout these stories, but just the missions did kind of, you know, they changed depending on what kind of unit you're in. One of the stories is from a Green Beret who's a medic, Ron Schurer, who, you know, horrifying story of them getting ambushed on a mountainside at night, no, in the daylight, as they were trying to do a snatch and grab, and just had bad intelligence. They get ambushed, and he has to expose himself multiple times to withering enemy fire, to treat people who were terribly wounded and were about to bleed out. And so there, I mean, the medics come through. He's a great example of how brave the medics are in this pantheon of service.
Anything else you'd like to say concerning this book?
Well, not just
Please pick it up, right?
please pick it up, and if you see a veteran or someone in uniform, go up and shake their hand and tell them you not only appreciate their service, but we'd like to hear more about their service.
Now, what are you working on now?
Going back into the journalism, so working on that, working on a lot of Ukraine stuff, obviously, trying to figure out what that means for the future. It's, you know, unfortunately reminiscent of the worst days of the Cold War, or even 1930. So I think it's going to rock America's world in the long term. And I'm not sure that the public is quite grasped just how monumental this is as a challenge to the sort of international order that we put in place. And it's been pretty good for the last 70 years, and now being challenged frontally.
Have you been over?
I have not been to Ukraine. No. Now I'm kind of freelancing now, so I'm gonna leave it to the young beat reporters right now. But I trying to think the long term has always been my specialty. So I'm trying to think of how this is going to impact any number of things like nuclear weapons and arms control and NATO, and it's plenty to write about. Unfortunately, I think, like I say, I think it's going to change our world in ways that we really haven't anticipated.
It's like we support an ROTC program where we bring ROTC cadets through the AHEC, through the Army Heritage Education Center. And we show them some of the resources that they can draw on when they get commissioned and they're out in units. And some of the old manuals that they could look at. One of the things I used to like to show them was the old NBC manuals. When the first school that a lieutenant went, typically when they got to the unit, was the Chem Bio school, where they had to learn how to do downwind predictions for nukes. I hope we never return back to that, where we actually require everybody. But yeah, you start getting nervous.
I spent 3.5 weeks in that Chem Bio suit, you know, fully expecting Saddam to rain down poison gas on us in Iraq. And I got very sick of that and the gas mask.
So the gas mask, okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to seeing your articles in the Atlantic, if you still write for them.
Occasionally.
And if you ever get a chance, please come up here to the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center. We'll walk you through the manuscript collection. There might be something there that piques your interest as a comparative study. So since we are the Army's premier holding for not official documents, that you get to go to NARA, our focus is individual soldier letters, diaries, personal experience monographs.
Great.
So
I'd love to visit. Hope to
I'd
visit
love to get you
sometime.
up here. Okay, well, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your week.
You too. Thanks, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Take care.